Good day, everyone, and welcome to Leadership Synergized, where we have a chance to talk to special people, individuals who come out and serve others and put value where it needs to be placed in our world as they work to expand and multiply leaders and positivity throughout our life and society. And I'm very pleased to bring back a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Randy Mills. Dr. Mills recently wrote a book about Larry Bird's high school days on the basketball court called As If by Magic. Dr. Mills, my friend, welcome back. It's been more than 6 months now. A lot of things have taken place, but it's great to see you, my friend.
Time marches on.
Yes, it does. And for you, I'm sure it's been kind of like a whirlwind. You've been doing a lot of these talks, discussions, podcasts, book signings, and just sharing the story a little bit. Tell us, how's it been going for you these past several months as the book launched last fall?
You know, I could write a book about writing a book and doing book signings because that's a whole nother adventure. And I always tell people, this is my ninth book. I always tell people that when you write a book, there's four parts to it. Trying to grab a hold of something and nail it down, doing the research, and then you start writing, which leads to more research and maybe even making big changes. And then there's the finding the publisher, and then there's the book sales, which is what I'm in now. But it's been going very well. It's always surprising to see who shows up and who doesn't show up when you do some of these local events, because I had many, as you know, basketball players from that era in the book. It just wasn't about Larry Bird and his high school basketball days. It was about all his competition and the people who helped him, including the people he played against that made him better. And so, yeah, I go to these places and I see people who probably have not done a whole lot of reading, who are just really excited about the book, which makes me happy, because not so much for the book sale, but just the fact that they're going to be really entertained and learn what a good story can do, I think, for them. Good crowds, new connections. I've been trying to break into the Boston area, and it's been hard to do because I just don't have any East Coast connections. But I was at a Paoli book signing the other day, and I was complaining to a guy, and he said, "Hey, I've got a former student of mine. He's out there, and he's connected with a guy that does a podcast out there." And he gave me a name. In fact, he gave me two names. And so I'm working on that, but that looks like it could be fruitful. At least I'll get a look-see there. Yeah, the book's gone well. I think it's also interesting for me to start seeing things that I did not talk about, that when I read and reread the book and talk to people who are reading the book, I see some nuances that I didn't follow that are very interesting to me. For example, if you'd like a quick example of that, and we can talk about this some more, it's really interesting to me, Kevin, how people, when it comes to Larry Bird, he's kind of like Abraham Lincoln, and I often say that, but he really is. He's really
You have said that before in our previous interviews, a little bit of a
yes, yes.
comparison to Honest Abe.
Yeah, he's very iconic, and they have a lot in common. Their poor upbringing and how they broke through, and who would have thought it. But in looking at Larry and his story, and I'm just amazed how people project from the future. Let me give you an example. So I'm reading about Larry Bird in his college days when he first came to Indiana State University. And this guy's being interviewed, and the interviewer says, "Well, what was Larry like?" He said, "Oh, he was as good as he was there. He was just this amazing player." Well, I was a little suspicious of that, because it takes time for those kinds of things to develop. So I actually had a friend. In fact, he was a former provost at Oakland City University, and he had played against Larry during that time when Larry was a red shirt that summer. So I asked Jeff about that. And Jeff said, "Well, my job was to guard Larry, because we were about the same height. He was a little taller than me at the time." And he said, when Larry came underneath, I could handle him okay. he said, now when he came across the line, 10-second line, if he put up a shot, you weren't going to stop it. But he said people weren't shooting out as much during that time. He said the other thing I remember about Larry was these one-handed passes that he would make from one end of the court to the other. It's like a pinpoint baseball pass. And if you weren't looking, you were going to get hurt. And then I said, well, how good was he? He said, well, he wasn't there yet. And so and then I read where another guy remarked to the first guy I was talking about, and he said, well, that guy, that's not right, that he's projecting into the past. And so I thought, wow, that's really true. And here's another example of that. We've talked about this before too. Coach Jones, when you see some of when he was interviewed and so forth, he talked about how Larry was there, by his junior year. Well, if that was the case, why didn't Jim stay? He wasn't there, and we know that. We've talked about this. It was a senior-led team. Larry was a junior. He was probably getting there the last half of the last half of the season, and even then he was still 6'3", and nobody was looking at him yet, except for Indiana State, who had found him through coming to see Steve Land play. Steve was kind of was the main leader of that team and set all the records that year in scoring and rebounding. So you see that often where people, when they remember back to Larry, they're projecting things from Larry's future, and he's not there yet. And I realized that the more I start thinking about my book, boy, he really wasn't there his sophomore year. And he wasn't there at the beginning of his junior year. In fact, when you look at newspaper accounts and sports writers, Larry's name is rarely mentioned. It's always Steve Land, Danny King, or Tony Clark. So I find that fascinating because it's gives you some sense of what I tried to correct when I wrote the book. I wanted to put the book and Larry's story in real time. And in looking back now and thinking about this, I see that I did a pretty good job of putting that in real time. Some people may be upset by that. I don't think so. If they think Larry's going to be this amazing player, no, he struggled. In fact, to me, that's the beauty of a story, what he overcame, how he got there, the people who helped him, the events. If just one of those people or events hadn't happened, we wouldn't be having this talk now. So that's been reinforced, I think, over time as I've gone to these book signings and thought more and more about the book.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We probably just stop a minute just in case anybody's viewing this and they're thinking, well, who's Larry Bird? Let's calibrate a little bit, right? We're talking about the NBA Hall of Famer, three-time NBA most valuable player, 84, 85, 86, 1984, 85, 86. Now, last century, Dr. Mills, as we look at this and we think about this, we're talking about the Larry Bird that won 3 world championships playing with the Boston Celtics and retired in 1992. He won the world championship with the Celtics in 81, 84, and 86. Were in the NBA Finals, went up against Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar throughout the 1980s. Was a member of the original Dream Team. I'm not sure you can ever have another Dream Team once you have the Dream Team type
Yes.
thing, winning the Olympic gold medal in 1992 when the United States was probably the last or one of the last countries to inject professionals into the Olympics. And then later was NBA Coach of the Year, took the Indiana Pacers up against the Lakers while he coached there for 3 years in the NBA Finals, the only time the Indiana Pacers have been there in the NBA Finals, even though they won several ABA championships, American Basketball Association championships in the 1960s and 1970s. Starred was a College Player of the Year in 1979, led Indiana State to the final game of the NC2A championship with Magic Johnson. And Larry and Magic credited with turning the NBA around. The early 1980s NBA finals were tape delayed, believe it or not, in those pieces. And the Celtics, I think, had won maybe 20-some games the year before Larry came in and took that very proud franchise back to where it needed to be, along with players like Danny Ainge and Robert Parrish and Dennis Johnson and Kevin McHale and Cedric Maxwell and to some degree Rick Roby and Chris Ford and Casey Jones as coach. Just a whole lot of legacy-based history there that even takes us back to Bill Russell and the San Francisco Dons and their dominance in the NC2A many years ago. And Larry may have even been the NBA Executive of the Year in that
I
particular
believe he
piece.
was. Yes.
Yeah, I think he was too. Just a rare feat with all the accolades and the talents that he has carried in. But just to calibrate a little bit too, Dr. Mills has written a number of books. I think you said 9 books now in that aspect, and played basketball in the southern part of Illinois. Again, back in last century, right? I'm not
Yes.
trying to age us, Dr. Mills, but it's not the current century in that particular piece. And you wrote a number of books. You served more than 30 plus years in education, both in public education and at higher education. In particular, majority of those years with Oakland City University, located just about half an hour north of Evansville, Indiana, in the very southwestern tip of the state. And Dr. Mills has written a book called As If by Magic. Not sure you can see this. My camera's breaking up, but it's really the story about Larry Bird in regards to some of his high school days in that aspect. And Dr. Mills, I'm so happy it's worked out well. The book launched late fall of 2024, but I want to jump back a little bit to something you're talking about the projection piece. And, as you're talking, I'm reflecting, and one of the things that jump out at me when you hear superstars, the GOAT, Michael Jordan, reflect and talk about Larry. You hear about the James Worthies, the Michael Cooper. Cooper noted for his defensive prowess. In particular, I think Larry said one of the hardest people he's ever played
Yes.
against, if not
Yes.
the hardest. And everybody talks about Larry's, for lack of a better word, mind and his brilliance and being ahead of everyone else, so to speak, and how he saw the game. And, when you think about that projection piece, right? And perhaps, and maybe it's very true that Larry's physical pieces weren't fully there in those points, but that kind of ties together, right? Because if it was his mind and his ability, his brain to outthink others on the court and think ahead of others, that's part of a life maturation process. And all those experiences we're still building during that sophomore, junior, senior year of high school. And then through the decision points he made going to Indiana for a short period of time, Indiana University, then coming back home, working in his hometown area, French Lick, West Baden Springs, and then coming out for Northwood Institute. It was a very small culinary college in West Baden, Indiana at the time, and played basketball for just a little bit with Northwood, and then played on AAU teams, with the for those of us from the Springs Valley, West Baden, French Lick era, with the late Chuck Akers, who was just a marvelous man from the state of Kentucky, and taught and coached football and officiated and had a skill to play basketball as well. Monk Clemens with that Hancock Construction AAU team in Mitchell. But when you think about all that, and that gets him back to Indiana State, it kind of makes a great deal of sense, right? It was still that maturation piece, not only physically, but the mental part of the game that was still forming for him.
You hit something really maybe the nail on the head uh, as you've brought this up in my mind. Uh, Coaches, Gary Holland and Jim Jones was talking about Larry Bird when he was in Biddy Ball, that he had such court sense. They saw it then.
Mm,
And court sense can cover a multitude of weaknesses.
mm,
And he always had that, and that just got better. So I think you're right. And he always had that court sense. You see that in his junior year, when there are articles about Larry, and there are, but they're in the local papers. You don't see any in the bigger papers. But there are a few articles that mention Larry's passing and Larry's anticipation of what was going on, and it was enough that it was just doggone stunning.
mm,
When you have that ability to anticipate, you know exactly where to go, what to do, where the pass is going to come to, where the direction somebody's going to go. And even when you're on offense, I think Larry had that ability to anticipate where the weakness was on his move. If I go this way, this guy's going to lean a little bit, and then I can
mm.
pop around him. So I think you're very much your point's well taken there. It goes back a long, long way. So all of that's happening. He's getting better, and boy, you can't make 4 inches of growth happen either between his
No,
junior
that's
and
pretty important in this story,
senior
isn't it?
year. Yes, yes. And I think he would have been, had he stayed 6'3", he probably would have played, he might have played at Indiana State.
It's just great to have been able to follow the story from beginning until now and reliving a lot of it. And you've brought that back to life for a lot of us. And from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate you and I thank you for all you do. And I look forward to catching up with you again in the very near future.
Okay, sounds great, Kevin. Let's do this again.
God bless you, my brother. I love you and keep at it. And thank you all for joining Dr. Mills and I on this episode of Leadership Synergized. May your day be filled with love, God's grace, and guidance. Thank you.